What would you do if a $60 million deal was about to collapse, and the only person who could save it was someone nobody even noticed? What if I told you that a janitor, a man who hadn't touched a piano in 8 years, walked into a room full of Silicon Valley investors and changed everything with nothing but his bare hands and 88 keys? Picture this. A conference room on the 42nd floor, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. 20 of the most powerful venture capitalists in America sitting in leather chairs, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of technology that just moments ago had promised to revolutionize healthcare. But now those screens are black, dead. The technology has failed at the worst possible moment. And in the corner of that room, barely visible to most, sits a grand piano. It's been there for years, just decoration gathering dust. Nobody's played it. Nobody's even looked at it. Until today. Because right now, in this very moment, a 55-year-old man in a janitor's uniform is sitting at that piano. His calloused fingers' hands that have spent the last 8 years pushing mops and emptying trash cans are hovering over the keys. The CEO of the company stands beside him, desperation in his eyes. The investors are gathering their things, preparing to leave. Everything is falling apart. And then he begins to play. The first note cuts through the silence like a knife. Then another, and suddenly everyone stops. Briefcases that were being closed remain open. Investors who were standing sit back down. The woman who had her hand on the door handle lets it go. Because something extraordinary is happening. How did we get here? Who is this man? And why is a janitor sitting at a grand piano during the most important business presentation of the year to understand that we need to go back? Back to where this impossible day began. 2 hours earlier. 2 hours before everything changed, the morning started like any other at TechVantage headquarters in downtown San Francisco. Well, not quite like any other. Today was the day. The day that Richard Bennett, founder and CEO of TechVantage, had been working toward for 5 years. The day that would determine whether his company's revolutionary artificial intelligence healthcare platform would get the funding it needed to save lives, or whether it would become just another promising startup that never quite made it. $60 million. That's what was on the line. $60 million from Apex Venture Partners, one of the most prestigious venture capital firms in Silicon Valley. The kind of money that doesn't just fund a company. It validates it. It transforms it. It makes everything possible. Richard had barely slept in 3 days. He'd rehearsed his presentation 73 times. He knew every word, every slide, every data point. His CTO, Jessica Torres, had tested the demo system 42 times. 42 perfect runs. No glitches, no errors. Everything worked flawlessly. The conference room on the 42nd floor had been prepared with meticulous care. Custom lighting, premium sound system, catering from the city's finest restaurant. Even the temperature had been calibrated to exactly 71 degrees, the optimal temperature for focus and alertness, according to the latest research. Everything was perfect. Everything was ready. The investors were scheduled to arrive at 10 o'clock. It was now 8:15. Richard Bennett stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, looking out over the city he'd called home for the past decade. At 42 years old, he'd already founded 2 successful tech companies. But TechVantage was different. TechVantage mattered. His AI platform could predict patient deterioration hours before traditional monitoring systems. It could identify patterns in medical data that even the best doctors missed. In the 12 hospitals currently using the beta version, patient mortality rates had dropped by 18%. 18%. That wasn't just a statistic. That was thousands of lives that would be saved every year once the system rolled out nationwide. But to make that happen, Richard needed capital. Serious capital. The kind that only came from firms like Apex. Down the hall, Jessica Torres was in the server room running one final systems check. At 36, Jessica was one of the most brilliant software engineers in the healthcare technology space. She'd left a six-figure job at Google to join Richard's vision. She believed in what they were building. She believed it could change the world. "All systems green," she said into her phone, updating Richard. "We're go for launch." "Copy that," Richard replied. "See you in the conference room at 9:30. Neither of them noticed the man pushing a maintenance cart down the hallway. Neither of them saw him pause outside the server room, checking his list of tasks for the day. Neither of them knew his name, even though he'd been working in this building for 8 years. His name was Damon Cole. Damon was 55 years old, though the hard years had made him look closer to 65. He stood 5'10" with broad shoulders that came from decades of physical labor. His hair was more gray than black, now cut short and simple. His hands were large with calluses on the palms and fingers. Working hands. Hands that had scrubbed countless floors, hauled countless bags of trash, fixed countless things that broke in the invisible infrastructure that kept buildings like this running. He wore the standard janitor's uniform, navy blue shirt with his name embroidered on the pocket, matching pants, steel-toed boots that had seen better days but still did the job, a ring of keys on his belt that could open most doors in the building. People walked past Damon every single day. Dozens of them, hundreds of them, software engineers and product managers and executives and interns. They walked past him in the hallways, in the elevators, in the break rooms. But they didn't see him. Not really. He was part of the background, part of the furniture. The invisible workforce that made their visible work possible. Damon preferred it that way. He'd been invisible for 8 years now, ever since he'd left New Orleans, and everything he'd once been behind. Ever since the accident. Ever since the day that music died for him. But that was a long time ago. A different life. A different Damon. This Damon just wanted to finish his morning rounds, have his lunch in the maintenance room, and go home to his small apartment in the Tenderloin at the end of his shift. This Damon didn't make waves, didn't draw attention, just did his job and collected his paycheck every 2 weeks. That was enough. It had to be enough. He checked his task list. Conference room 42 needed to be cleaned and prepared. High priority. Some kind of important meeting happening today. Damon gathered his supplies and headed to the elevator. He had no idea that in less than 2 hours, everything he'd spent 8 years running from would catch up with him. By 9 o'clock, the conference room on the 42nd floor had been transformed into a showcase space. The long mahogany table gleamed under the carefully positioned lighting. 24 ergonomic chairs were perfectly aligned. At one end of the room, a massive display screen dominated the wall, flanked by 2 smaller screens for supplementary data. The TechVantage logo glowed softly in the corner of each screen, pulsing with a gentle blue light that suggested both technology and healthcare innovation and trust. Jessica was at the control panel making final adjustments to the presentation system. The demo would be spectacular. They'd recorded actual data from their beta hospital partners, anonymized but real. Viewers would see the AI system identify a patient showing early signs of sepsis 3 hours before the traditional alert systems triggered. They'd watch as it flagged a medication interaction that the pharmacy system had missed. They'd witness in real-time simulation how TechVantage's platform could save lives. "Audio check," Jessica said. Loud and clear, Richard responded from his position near the windows. Around them, the rest of the team moved with practiced efficiency. Sarah Chen from marketing was setting up the product samples on the display table. Michael Rodriguez from business development was reviewing the financial projections one last time. Everyone knew their role. Everyone understood what was at stake. Damon worked quietly in the corner, running a final dust mop across the hardwood floors. He'd already cleaned the windows, arranged the chairs, set up the water stations with precisely chilled bottles. Now, he was just doing the finishing touches, making sure everything was perfect for whatever important meeting these people had planned. As he worked, his eyes wandered to the grand piano, sitting in the far corner of the room. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway Model D concert, grand 9 feet of polished, ebony perfection. Damon knew it was a Steinway because he'd seen the logo countless times while dusting it over the years. He knew it was a Model D because once about 6 years ago, a tuner had come to service it, and Damon had overheard him talking about what a shame it was that such a magnificent instrument just sat there unplayed, nothing but expensive decoration. The tuner still came twice a year to maintain it. Company policy, apparently. The piano had been a gift from the building's original owner, some tech billionaire who fancied himself a patron of the arts. It stayed in tune, stayed perfect, but nobody ever played it. Damon had never touched it. Not once in 8 years. He dusted around it carefully, cleaned the bench, kept it looking pristine. But he never lifted the fallboard to reveal the keys, never sat down, never let his fingers remember what they once knew how to do. "Damon, that looks great, thank you," Richard said, pulling Damon's attention away from the piano. It was one of the few times Richard had actually spoken directly to him. "The investors will be here in 45 minutes. "Yes, sir," Damon replied. "I'll be out of your way in just a minute. No rush. We appreciate everything you do to keep this place running." Damon nodded and continued his work. Richard meant well, he could tell, but there was something almost comical about it. "We appreciate everything you do." As if Richard had any idea what Damon actually did, the 100 invisible tasks that happened every day to keep the building functional. As if appreciation translated into anything more than minimum wage and no benefits. But Damon wasn't bitter. Not anymore. Bitterness required energy, and he'd learned to conserve his energy for getting through each day. He finished the floors, checked his work one final time, and started gathering his supplies. "All set?" Jessica asked, not really looking at him, her attention focused on the screens. "All set." Damon confirmed. He pushed his cart toward the door just as the elevator dinged in the hallway. The first of the investors had arrived. Damon slipped out through the side door as a group of impeccably dressed men and women in tailored suits strode into the space. He caught a glimpse of their faces. Confidence. Power. The unmistakable bearing of people who controlled billions of dollars and knew it. This was their world. Damon was just passing through it, invisible as always. He pushed his cart down the hallway toward the maintenance closet, already thinking about his next task. The third-floor bathrooms needed restocking. The lobby windows could use another pass. The usual routine. Behind him in conference room 42, Richard Bennett was shaking hands with Victoria Ashford, the managing partner of Apex Venture Partners, the woman who would decide the fate of TechVantage. The pitch was about to begin. Victoria Ashford commanded attention the moment she entered the room. At 58 years old, she'd been in venture capital for 32 years and had backed some of the most successful tech companies of the past 3 decades. Forbes estimated her personal net worth at somewhere north of $400 million. She'd seen thousands of pitches, funded hundreds of companies, and watched most of them fail. She wasn't here to be impressed. She was here to evaluate whether TechVantage represented a calculated risk worth taking. Behind her came her team from Apex. Daniel Merchant, a partner specializing in healthcare technology. Patricia Wu, their chief financial analyst. Cameron Foster, a technical due diligence expert with a PhD in computer science from MIT. And 6 more associates, each bringing their own area of expertise. Also in the room were representatives from 2 other venture firms that Apex had invited to co-invest if the deal proved worthwhile. Thomas Brighton from Summit Peak Capital, Linda Okonkwo from Horizon Ventures. Both brought their own analysts and attorneys, 23 people in total. 23 of the most sophisticated investors in Silicon Valley, representing combined assets under management of approximately $47 billion. Richard felt the weight of all those eyes on him as he stood at the front of the room. "Thank you all for coming," began his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. "What I'm about to show you will change healthcare as we know it. More importantly, it will save lives, thousands of lives every single year." He clicked the remote. The screens came to life with the TechVantage logo, then transitioned to a stark image. A hospital room. A patient connected to monitors. Numbers and graphs filling the space around the bed. "This is Sarah Mitchell." Richard continued. "She's not real, but she represents someone very real. A 67-year-old woman who came into the emergency room with what seemed like a routine case of pneumonia. The standard monitoring systems showed nothing alarming. Her vital signs were stable. Her labs were within acceptable ranges. The doctors sent her to a regular hospital floor for observation and treatment." He paused, letting the tension build. 6 hours later, Sarah Mitchell went into septic shock. Her blood pressure crashed. Her organs began to fail. By the time the medical team recognized what was happening and moved her to the ICU, it was almost too late. She survived, but barely. And she'll deal with the consequences of that delayed treatment for the rest of her life. The investors watched, faces impassive. They'd heard tragic medical stories before. That wasn't enough. Richard clicked again. A new graphic appeared showing streams of data flowing into a central processor, lines of code running in the background, algorithms analyzing patterns. "Now let me show you what happens when TechVantage is in the picture." He nodded to Jessica, who initiated the demo sequence. The main screen transformed into a real-time simulation of their AI system, monitoring Sarah Mitchell. The same vital signs, the same lab values. Everything that appeared normal to human eyes and traditional alert systems. But in the corner of the screen, a small indicator began to pulse yellow. Then orange, then red. 3 hours before Sarah Mitchell crashed, Richard explained TechVantage's AI identified a pattern. A subtle decrease in oxygen saturation, barely noticeable. A slight elevation in lactate levels, still within normal range. A minute change in heart rate variability that traditional monitors ignore as noise. Individually, none of these things matter. But together, they form a pattern that our system has learned to recognize through analysis of millions of patient records. The demo showed the alert escalating, notifying the care team, triggering protocols. In this simulation, Sarah Mitchell received early intervention. She never crashed. She recovered fully and went home to her family. The investors leaned forward slightly. Now they were interested. For the next 20 minutes, Richard guided them through the technology. Jessica brought up additional demos showing the system's ability to predict complications, identify medication errors, optimize treatment protocols. The data was compelling. The potential applications were vast. The market opportunity was enormous. Richard could feel the energy in the room shifting. He'd given hundreds of presentations in his career, and he knew when an audience was truly engaged. This was one of those times. Victoria Ashford was taking notes, something she rarely did. Daniel Merchant was nodding at several of the technical specifications. Patricia Wu was already running mental calculations on the financial projections. Everything was going perfectly. Richard moved into the final section of the presentation, the part where he'd demonstrate the system's interface, show how easily it integrated with existing hospital infrastructure, prove that TechVantage wasn't just theoretically brilliant, but practically implementable. Now, he said, clicking to the next slide, let me show you the actual platform interface that's currently being used in 12 hospitals across. The screen went black. Not just one screen, all 3 screens, simultaneously. The gentle blue glow of the TechVantage logo vanished. The data displays disappeared. The interface demo that was supposed to be the climax of the presentation simply ceased to exist. Richard stood frozen, his remote hanging uselessly in his hand. Technical difficulties, he said, with a forced smile, trying to keep his voice calm. Give us just one moment. Jessica was already moving to the control panel, her fingers flying across the keyboard. One moment stretched into 10 seconds, then 20, then 30. The investors began shifting in their chairs. Jessica's fingers moved faster across the keyboard, running through every troubleshooting protocol she knew. Check the connections, restart the display system, reboot the main computer, reset the network connection. Nothing worked. The screens remained black, stubborn, and unresponsive, mocking every hour she'd spent preparing for this moment. Jessica Richards' voice held an edge of panic he couldn't quite suppress. Working on it, she replied, her own panic rising in her throat. This wasn't possible. She'd tested everything. Everything had worked perfectly just 30 minutes ago. She pulled out her tablet, trying to access the system remotely. The spinning wheel of death appeared on her screen. The network connection was dead. Not just slow, not just glitchy, completely, utterly dead. How long? Victoria Ashford asked. Her tone was neutral, but the question itself was damning. How long before we're wasting our time here? Just a few more minutes, Richard said, but his voice had lost its confidence. A few more minutes was an eternity in a presentation like this. A few more minutes was enough time for investors to check their phones, remember the 3 other meetings they had today, start calculating the opportunity cost of sitting in this room. Jessica unplugged cables and plugged them back in. She force-quit applications and relaunched them. She tried every trick she'd learned in 15 years of working with temperamental technology. The screens stayed black. Could be a server issue, she muttered, more to herself than anyone else. I need to check the server room. She grabbed her laptop and hurried toward the door, leaving Richard alone at the front of the room with 23 increasingly restless investors. I apologize for this, Richard said, trying to fill the silence. As I was saying before, the technical difficulty, our platform has been performing exceptionally well in our beta hospitals. We've seen an 18% reduction in patient mortality, a 23% decrease in adverse drug events, and we've read the materials Victoria interrupted, not unkindly but firmly. What we came here to see was the system in action. The demo, the interface, the thing that makes TechVantage different from the dozen other healthcare AI startups that have pitched us this year. Richard felt sweat forming at his temples, despite the carefully controlled room temperature. Of course. And we'll have that up and running in just. Richard Thomas Brighton from Summit Peak Capital spoke up. He was checking his watch. I have a flight to New York in 90 minutes. I really can't miss it. I understand, and I'm sure you do understand, Victoria said, standing up. But the reality is we need to see this system work. That's not optional. That's the entire point of this meeting. Others began standing as well. Patricia Wu closed her laptop. Cameron Foster was already checking his phone for messages. Please, Richard said, hating the desperation in his voice but unable to suppress it. Just give us 10 more minutes. I know Jessica can fix this. The system works. It absolutely works. We just... "I'm sure it does work," Victoria said, her tone softening slightly. "But we can't base a $60 million investment on assurances. We need to see it. So here's what I propose. You get your system working. You send us a complete recorded demo and we'll review it. If it's as impressive as you've described, we'll schedule a follow-up meeting." It was a polite dismissal. Richard knew what it meant. In Silicon Valley, "we'll schedule a follow-up meeting" was code for "we're not interested, but we're too professional to say it directly." By the time he sent them a recorded demo, they'd have moved on to the next opportunity. The moment would be lost. The momentum would be gone. $60 million was walking out the door. Down the hall, Jessica burst into the server room and immediately saw the problem. One of the main network switches had failed. Not just failed, catastrophically failed. Smoke damage on the ports, physical damage to the internal components. This wasn't a software glitch. This was hardware failure, and there was no quick fix. She'd need to replace the entire switch, reconfigure the network, restore the connections. Even working at emergency speed, it would take at least 2 hours. She pulled out her phone and called Richard. "It's bad," she said before he could even ask. "Network switch is fried. I can't fix this in time." She heard Richard take a shaky breath on the other end of the line. "Understood," he said quietly. "Thank you for trying." Back in the conference room, Victoria Ashford was gathering her materials. The others were doing the same. Some were already moving toward the door. Richard stood at the front of the room, watching 5 years of work collapse around him. All the late nights, all the sacrifices, all the belief that he was building something that mattered, something that could genuinely save lives. Gone. Because of a failed network switch. He thought about the 12 hospitals currently using TechVantage. He thought about the patients whose lives had been saved by early warnings from their system. He thought about the thousands more who could benefit if only he could get this funding, if only he could scale the platform nationally. He thought about Sarah Mitchell, the composite patient from his presentation. How many real Sarah Mitchells were out there right now, lying in hospital beds, heading toward preventable complications that TechVantage could detect and prevent? "Thank you all for your time," he managed to say. "I apologize again for the technical issues. I'll send you the complete demo by end of day tomorrow." Victoria nodded graciously. "We'll look forward to it." She turned toward the door. And that's when Damon Cole walked back into the room. Damon had been in this maintenance closet on the 41st floor when he'd heard the commotion above him. Voices in the hallway, footsteps moving quickly, the unmistakable sound of something going wrong in the carefully controlled corporate environment of TechVantage headquarters. He'd seen Jessica running toward the server room, her face tight with stress. He'd heard fragments of urgent phone conversations as people rushed past his position. None of it was his business. He'd learned long ago to keep his head down, stay in his lane, not get involved in the dramas of the white-collar world happening around him. But then he'd remembered that he'd left his cleaning cart in the conference room. He'd been in such a hurry to get out of the way when the investors arrived that he'd forgotten to retrieve it. Standard protocol was to never leave equipment in public areas, especially during important meetings. So he'd taken the service elevator back up to the 42nd floor and made his way to the conference room, intending to slip in, grab his cart, and disappear again. He'd expected the meeting to still be in progress. He'd planned to wait outside until there was a natural break. But when he reached the door, he found it open. And inside, he saw something he hadn't expected. The investors were leaving. Not in the organized, satisfied way that meant a meeting had concluded successfully, but in the hurried, uncomfortable way that meant something had gone very wrong. Some were already in the hallway. Others were gathering their things, avoiding eye contact with the man standing at the front of the room. Richard Bennett stood there alone. His shoulders slumped, his expression a mixture of devastation and forced professional composure. Damon recognized that expression. He'd worn it himself 8 years ago on the worst day of his life. The screens behind Richard were black, dead. Whatever presentation he'd been giving had clearly failed in the most catastrophic way possible. Damon hesitated at the door, unsure whether to enter or come back later for his cart. And then his eyes landed on the piano. The Steinway Model D in the corner, its polished ebony surface reflecting the afternoon light from the windows. The instrument that had sat silent and unused for all the years Damon had worked in this building. The piano that he'd carefully cleaned and maintained and never, ever played. Something happened in that moment. Something Damon couldn't quite explain later even to himself. Maybe it was the expression on Richard's face. Maybe it was the sight of something important falling apart. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light was hitting the piano at that exact angle, making it almost glow with invitation. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe Damon was just tired of running, tired of being invisible, tired of pretending that the music had died inside him, when really it had just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up. He stepped into the room. Richard looked up, noticed him for the first time. "It's fine, Damon. You can get your cart later." But Damon wasn't looking at Richard. He was looking at the piano. And for the first time in 8 years, he was seeing it not as an object to clean around, but as what it actually was. An instrument. A voice. A way to say things that words couldn't express. Sir Damon heard himself say his voice rough from disuse in conversations that mattered. "Let me try something." Richard blinked, confused. "I'm sorry," what Damon gestured toward the piano. "Let me try something. To help." "I don't understand," Richard said. Several of the investors had paused in their exit, curious about this unexpected development. "You needed to show them something," Damon said, the words coming faster now, driven by an impulse he didn't fully understand. "Your technology failed. But maybe there's another way to show them what you're trying to say." With a piano, Richard's confusion was evident, but so was something else. Desperation. The willingness to try anything, no matter how unlikely to salvage something from this disaster. Sometimes Damon said quietly, music can say things that technology can't. Victoria Ashford, who had been halfway to the door, stopped and turned around. "This is highly irregular." "I know," Richard said. He looked at Damon. Really looked at him probably for the first time in however many years Damon had been cleaning these floors. "Can you actually play?" Damon nodded slowly. "I used to, a long time ago." "How long ago?" 8 years. The room was completely silent now. Everyone had stopped. Even the people in the hallway were peering back and trying to understand what was happening. Richard looked at the dead screens, then back at Damon, then at Victoria, and the other investors who were watching this strange scene unfold. "What did he have to lose? Okay," Richard said. "Show us." Damon walked toward the piano. Each step felt like moving through water, heavy with the weight of everything he'd been carrying for 8 years. As he crossed the room, he passed within a few feet of Victoria Ashford. She was studying him with frank curiosity, probably wondering if this was some kind of performance art, some strange Silicon Valley pitch tactic she hadn't seen before. He reached the piano and stood before it for a long moment. The fallboard was closed, hiding the keys. His hand reached out, trembling slightly, and lifted it. 88 keys. 52 white, 36 black. Ivory and ebony, though probably plastic substitutes in a piano this modern. But the layout was eternal, unchanged. The same keyboard that Mozart and Beethoven and Chopin had played, the same keys that Damon himself had played for 42 years before he stopped. He pulled out the bench and sat down. His hands hovered over the keys, not quite touching them yet. In that moment, frozen between silence and sound, Damon thought about his wife, about Angela, about the way she used to sit in the front row of whatever club he was playing, nursing a single drink all night, just listening. About how she'd told him that his music made the world make sense. About the night she died. About the funeral where he couldn't play. About the 8 years since then where he'd convinced himself that the music had died with her. But sitting here now, feeling the familiar shape of the bench beneath him, seeing the keys waiting for his touch, Damon realized something. The music hadn't died. He'd just been too afraid to let it live. His fingers descended to the keys, and he began to play. The first notes were tentative, uncertain. The sound of hands remembering something they'd forced themselves to forget. Damon's fingers stumbled slightly on the keys' muscle memory, fighting against 8 years of disuse. The notes came out disconnected, hesitant, like someone speaking a language they once knew fluently, but haven't practiced in years. But even those broken, uncertain notes were enough to command attention. The investors who had been leaving stopped completely now. This wasn't what any of them had expected. This wasn't a pitch. This wasn't a demo. This was something else entirely, something human and raw, and impossible to categorize in the neat boxes of venture capital decision-making. Damon closed his eyes, trying to find his way back into the music. And as his fingers moved across the keys, memories flooded back with such intensity that he almost stopped playing. New Orleans, 1985. A 15-year-old Damon sitting at an upright piano in the back room of his grandmother's house in the 7th Ward. She'd been a gospel singer, his grandmother. She'd taught him his first chords, his first songs. She'd told him that music was prayer, made audible, that God spoke through melodies as clearly as through words. He'd believed her. He'd devoted himself to the piano with the fervor of the converted. By 17, he was playing in clubs on Frenchman Street. By 20, he had a regular gig at one of the jazz venues in the quarter. By 25, he was considered one of the best jazz pianists in a city famous for its jazz pianists. He never got famous, never recorded an album, never toured nationally. But in New Orleans, in that particular scene, Damon Cole was somebody. People came specifically to hear him play. Other musicians respected him. He made enough money doing what he loved to pay his bills, and feel like maybe, just maybe, his grandmother had been right about music being his calling. Then he met Angela. She'd come into the club on a Thursday night in 1998 there, with friends celebrating someone's birthday. Damon was playing a slow, bluesy number, something he'd improvised on the spot. And when he looked up, he saw her. Saw the way she was listening, not just hearing, but truly listening, her entire being focused on the music he was creating. After his set, she'd approached him. That last song, she'd said. What was it called? It doesn't have a name, he'd replied. I made it up as I went. You made that up. She'd looked at him like he'd performed magic. Right there in the moment. That's what jazz is, he'd said. Making it up. Finding your way through it. They'd talked until the club closed. Then they'd talked outside until dawn broke over the Mississippi. 3 months later, they were married in a small ceremony at his grandmother's church, with Damon playing a song he'd written just for Angela on the same upright piano where he'd learned his first chords. For 14 years, they'd built a life together. Angela worked as a nurse at Charity Hospital. Damon played his gigs and gave piano lessons during the day to kids in the neighborhood. They never had much money, but they had enough. They had each other. They had music. They'd survived Hurricane Katrina together, evacuating to Houston, and then returning to rebuild. They'd survived the lean years when the clubs were slow to reopen. They'd survived everything the world threw at them because they had each other. Until the night in 2017 when Angela was driving home from a late shift at the hospital and a drunk driver ran a red light at the intersection of St. Claude and Elysian Fields. She died before the ambulance arrived. The police told Damon that she probably never knew what hit her. They said that like it was supposed to be comforting. Damon had tried to play at her funeral. He'd wanted to give her one last song the way he'd given her thousands of songs during their years together. But when he sat down at the piano in the church, his fingers wouldn't move. It was like they'd forgotten everything they'd ever known. Like the music had been buried with Angela in that cemetery in the 9th Ward. He'd left New Orleans 3 months after the funeral, left his gigs, left his students, left his grandmother's house, and all the memories it contained. He'd driven west with no particular destination in mind, just away. Away from the clubs where he'd played. Away from the streets where they'd walked together. Away from everything that reminded him of what he'd lost. He'd ended up in San Francisco by accident. His car had broken down in the Tenderloin, and he'd found a cheap room while waiting for repairs. The repairs had taken longer than expected. The room had become permanent, and when the money from selling his possessions back in New Orleans started running out, he'd taken the first job he could find that didn't require much talking or thinking or being visible. He'd become a janitor, a custodian, invisible. For 8 years, he'd cleaned floors and emptied trash cans and maintained the invisible infrastructure of the building. For 8 years, he'd walked past that Steinway Model D every single day and never let himself remember what it felt like to play. For 8 years, he'd convinced himself that this was enough, that this was what his life was now, that the music had died with Angela, and he was just waiting out his time until he could join her. But now, sitting at this piano with his fingers on the keys, Damon realized that he'd been lying to himself. The music hadn't died. It had been waiting. Waiting for the right moment. Waiting for him to be ready to let it back in. And maybe, just maybe, today was that moment. His fingers found their rhythm. The uncertain, stumbling notes began to coalesce into something more confident, something purposeful, something that sounded less like someone trying to remember and more like someone who never forgot, who just needed permission to remember. Damon opened his eyes and looked out at the room full of investors and executives and all these people in their expensive suits who lived in a world completely different from his own. And he began to truly play. The music changed. It was subtle at first, a shift in confidence, a deepening of tone. The notes that had been hesitant and disconnected began to flow together, forming phrases, building melodies. Damon's hands moved across the keys with increasing certainty. The muscle memory was coming back, 8 years of rust falling away with each passing measure. His left hand found a steady rhythm, a walking bass line that anchored the improvisation. His right hand began to explore testing ideas following instincts that he'd thought were dead, but were merely sleeping. He started with something simple. A basic blues progression in E-flat. Nothing fancy. Just the foundation, the bedrock that all jazz is built on. 12 bars of tension and release, question, and answer the conversation that happens between the chords and the melody. But even in that simplicity, there was something compelling. Maybe it was the way Damon's touch on the keys was both gentle and firm, coaxing sound from the instrument, rather than forcing it. Maybe it was the slight hesitations he left in the rhythm, the spaces between notes that gave the music room to breathe. Maybe it was just the sheer unexpectedness of the moment, the cognitive dissonance of watching a janitor in a work uniform create something beautiful in the middle of what was supposed to be a tech presentation. Richard stood transfixed, his earlier panic temporarily forgotten. He had no idea what was happening, no idea where Damon had learned to play like this, no idea what this had to do with saving his company or his presentation or anything else. But he found himself unable to look away. Victoria Ashford had returned to her seat. She wasn't checking her phone. She wasn't looking at her watch. She was watching Damon's hands on the keys, listening to the music unfold, trying to understand what this moment was and why it felt important. The other investors had stopped their exit as well. Some still stood briefcases in hand, paused in mid-escape. Others had returned to their chairs. All of them were listening now, whatever they'd been planning to do next, temporarily suspended. Damon felt their attention, but didn't acknowledge it. He was back in the zone, now that mental space where nothing existed except the piano, and the music, and the conversation happening between them. Time moved differently in the zone. Minutes could feel like seconds. The outside world receded until it was just sensation and sound and the endless possibilities contained in 88 keys. He let the blues progression repeat, but each time through he varied it slightly, changed the voicing of a chord, added a different run, explored a different register of the piano. It was like having a conversation with an old friend, relearning their patterns, remembering how they think, falling back into familiar rhythms. The Steinway responded beautifully. It was a magnificent instrument, Damon realized. Perfectly tuned, perfectly maintained. All those years of sitting silent, and it had been ready all along for someone to play it like this, to wake it up and let it sing. As Damon played, he started thinking about what Richard had been trying to demonstrate before the technology failed. Something about artificial intelligence and healthcare. Something about predicting problems before they became catastrophic. Something about patterns that humans couldn't see, but machines could detect. In a strange way, jazz was similar. It was about patterns, too. About recognizing musical structures, anticipating where the harmony wanted to go, finding the logic in what seemed like spontaneous improvisation. The best jazz musicians were pattern recognition machines, their brains processing thousands of possibilities in real time, choosing the notes that made the most sense in the context of what came before and what might come next. Maybe that's what Damon could do. Maybe he could translate Richard's message into musical terms. Not explain it exactly, but evoke it. Create something that felt like what Richard had been describing. Something about patterns and prediction and intervention and healing. Damon shifted the progression slightly, moving away from the straightforward blues into something more complex. He introduced a secondary dominant, a brief modulation that created tension. Then he resolved it in an unexpected way, landing on a chord that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. Several people in the room leaned forward slightly, unconsciously pulled in by the music's logic. Damon smiled just a little. He was finding it now. Finding the flow. Finding the place where his hands knew what to do, without his conscious mind having to direct them. He thought about Angela, about how she used to say that his playing told stories. I don't always understand the story she'd said once, but I can feel it. I can feel what you're trying to say. What was he trying to say today? Maybe something about hope, about unexpected solutions, about how sometimes the answer comes from the last place you'd think to look. Maybe something about hidden depths, about how people are more than they appear, about how the janitor you walk past every day without seeing might contain multitudes. Or maybe something simpler, maybe something about the fact that beauty and meaning can emerge from chaos. That even when systems fail and technology breaks down, there's still something human and vital that can bridge the gap. Damon's right hand climbed higher on the keyboard, the melody becoming more lyrical. His left hand maintained the rhythm, but added counter-melodies, harmonic layers that gave the music depth and complexity. He was fully back now. Not the tentative player from 5 minutes ago feeling his way through cobwebs of memory, but the musician he'd been in New Orleans, confident and creative, letting the music flow through him rather than trying to force it out. Jessica had returned from the server room, ready to deliver the bad news about the irreparable network switch. But she stopped at the doorway, stunned by what she was hearing. She knew Damon by sight, had probably passed him in the hallways hundreds of times without really registering his presence. And now here he was playing like a professional, like someone who'd trained for decades, like someone who understood music in the way that Jessica understood code as a language with its own logic and beauty. Richard caught Jessica's eye and shook his head slightly. Not now. Whatever news she had, it could wait. Something else was happening here. Something neither of them fully understood, but both of them could feel. Damon built the music higher, adding flourishes, taking risks. A rapid run up the keyboard. A cluster chord that shouldn't have resolved, but did. A quote from a jazz standard, just a brief reference woven into his improvisation like a secret message. And then, just when the music seemed like it might climax, Damon pulled back. He simplified. Returned to the basic blues pattern he'd started with. But now it was transformed by everything that had come before. The same progression, but richer, deeper, full of implied complexity. It was like watching a story return to its beginning, but with all the wisdom gained from the journey in between. Damon let the progression repeat one more time, and then with a final chord, he brought the first section of his improvisation to a close. Silence filled the room. But it was a different kind of silence than before. Not the awkward silence of a failed presentation, not the uncomfortable silence of people waiting to leave. This was the silence of people processing something unexpected, the silence of surprise and curiosity, and the beginning of understanding that something unusual was unfolding. Damon's hands rested on the keys. He wasn't done. He knew that. He could feel there was more to say, more to explore. But this was a good place to pause, to take a breath, to acknowledge that he'd made it through the first movement of whatever this impromptu performance was becoming. He looked up for the first time since he'd started playing. Looked at the investors who were no longer leaving. Looked at Richard, whose expression had transformed from desperation to bewilderment to something that might have been the beginning of hope. Looked at Jessica in the doorway, her mouth slightly open in surprise. And in that moment, Damon made a decision. He was going to finish this. He was going to play something that these people would remember. Not because he wanted recognition or praise or anything like that, but because it felt right. Because after 8 years of silence, he had something to say. Because the music was back, and he needed to honor that gift. He placed his hands on the keys again, and he began the second movement. The second movement started differently. Where the first section had been rooted in blues and jazz traditions, familiar territory that Damon could navigate almost automatically, this new section was more exploratory, more personal. He began with a simple melodic line in the right hand played high on the keyboard. It was almost childlike in its simplicity, reminiscent of the first songs he'd learned from his grandmother all those decades ago. But beneath it, his left hand created something complex and modern dissonant chords that created tension against the simple melody. The juxtaposition was striking. Innocence and experience, past and present. The child who'd first fallen in love with music, and the man who'd lost everything, and was now finding his way back. Damon's eyes were closed again. He was deep in the music now, no longer thinking about the room, or the people, or the strange circumstances that had led him to this piano. He was just playing, just existing in the eternal now of musical improvisation. Memories continued to flood through him as he played. He remembered his grandmother's funeral when he was 19. He'd played His Eye Is on the Sparrow at her service, and everyone had said it was beautiful, that she would have been proud. But what Damon remembered most was the moment after the funeral, sitting alone at that upright piano in her house, playing not the hymn, but a jazz piece she'd always loved, letting his grief transform into something beautiful and painful and true. His hands found that same emotional space, now that place where sorrow and beauty intertwined. The melody became more complex, more searching. The harmonies shifted from dissonant to consonant, and back again, never settling, always moving forward. He thought about all the gigs he'd played in New Orleans, the good nights when everything clicked and the music flowed like water, the rough nights when nothing worked and he'd had to grind through his sets trying to find something worth playing. The nights when Angela was in the audience and nothing else mattered because he was playing for her, only for her. He thought about the night they'd met, the improvised blues he'd been playing when she walked in. He tried to remember how it went, what notes he'd chosen, what harmonic path he'd followed. The specifics were lost to time, but the feeling remained. And Damon channeled that feeling into what he was playing now, weaving it into the fabric of his improvisation. The music grew more intense. His hands moved faster, covering more of the keyboard, the melody line fragmenting and reforming the left hand, creating polyrhythms that suggested two different time signatures happening simultaneously. It was the kind of playing that came from decades of practice, from thousands of hours of improvisation, from a deep understanding of music theory that had been internalized so completely, it became instinct. Richard found himself thinking about the presentation he'd been giving before the technology failed. He'd been trying to explain how TechVantage's AI could see patterns in medical data that humans couldn't detect, how it could process thousands of variables simultaneously, finding connections and relationships that were invisible to normal observation. Watching Damon play Richard, realized that was exactly what he was witnessing. Damon was processing musical patterns in real time, making split-second decisions about harmony and melody and rhythm, creating something coherent and beautiful out of chaos and possibility. He was demonstrating the exact kind of pattern recognition and intuitive processing that Richard had been trying to describe. Maybe that's what Damon had meant when he said music could say things technology couldn't. Not that music was better, but that it could make abstract concepts tangible, emotional, human. Victoria Ashford was having a different but related realization. She'd been in venture capital for over 3 decades. She'd heard every possible variation of every possible pitch. She'd seen companies present with slick demos and compelling data and charismatic founders. She'd learned to evaluate opportunities based on market size and competitive advantages and financial projections. But she'd also learned over the years that the best investments often came from something less quantifiable, a feeling, an intuition, a sense that something special was happening, even if she couldn't fully articulate why. That's what she was feeling now. Not because Damon was playing beautifully, though he was, but because of what his presence and his performance revealed about TechVantage as a company, about Richard as a leader, about the culture that must exist here for a janitor to feel comfortable, stepping up in a crisis to try something unconventional, to take a risk. The best companies Victoria had learned were the ones where unexpected value emerged from unexpected places, where the official org chart didn't fully capture the real relationships and contributions that made things work, where there was space for improvisation and innovation from every level of the organization. Damon's playing was demonstrating all of that without saying a word. The music shifted again. The intensity that had been building began to transform into something different. Still powerful, but no longer driving forward. Instead, it was opening up, becoming more spacious, allowing silence to enter between the notes. Damon was thinking about the 8 years he'd spent as a janitor. The 8 years of invisibility and routine, and telling himself that this was enough. He'd thought he was hiding, running away from his past and his pain. But maybe he thought now maybe he'd been preparing, learning, observing, seeing this world of technology and business and innovation from a perspective that nobody else had. Maybe that's why he was able to be here now, able to help in this strange way. Because he'd spent 8 years watching and learning and understanding even when he didn't realize that's what he was doing. His right hand climbed higher up the keyboard, reaching for the brightest, clearest notes. His left hand provided a foundation steady and sure. The two hands came together in a moment of perfect harmony, a brief glimpse of unity before separating again to continue their conversation. There were tears on Damon's face now, though he barely noticed them. They weren't tears of sadness, exactly. More like tears of release. 8 years of grief and suppression and denial flowing out of him through his fingers, through the piano, into the air, where they could finally dissipate. He thought about Angela again. Tried to imagine what she would say if she could see him now. Would she be angry that he'd stopped playing for so long? Would she be sad that he'd left New Orleans and everything they'd built together? No, he realized. She'd be proud. Proud that he was playing again. Proud that he was helping someone even in this strange, unexpected way. Proud that he'd found the courage to let the music back in. Play, she used to tell him. Play like your life depends on it. Because it does. We all need beauty. We all need something that makes sense when nothing else does. Damon played like his life depended on it. The second movement built to its own climax, different from the first. Where the first had ended with a return to simplicity, this one ended with complexity, with layers upon layers of harmonic and rhythmic ideas all happening simultaneously. It was almost too much, almost overwhelming. But then Damon resolved, it bringing all those disparate elements together into a single perfect chord. The sound hung in the air, resonating in the perfectly tuned strings of the Steinway, filling the room with its richness. And then slowly, Damon let it fade. Let the chord decay naturally until it disappeared into silence. He sat with his hands still on the keys, breathing heavily, feeling like he'd run a marathon. In a way, he had. An emotional marathon. A journey through 8 years of suppressed feelings and memories, and music. But he wasn't done yet. He could feel it. There was more to say. One more movement, one more section, the most important one. He took a deep breath, and he began the final movement of his improvisation. The final movement began with a question. A single melodic line, simple and clear, played in the middle register of the piano. It rose and fell, seeking something, searching for an answer that hadn't yet revealed itself. It was open-ended, inviting, like the first line of a conversation that could go anywhere. Damon played it once, then again slightly varied, then a third time with small ornamentations that added complexity without changing the essential nature of the question. And then his left hand answered. Not with words, of course, but with a counter-melody that responded to the question, acknowledged it, engaged with it. The two hands began to have a conversation, a musical dialogue, where each voice listened to the other, responded, built on what came before. It was, Damon realized, a metaphor for what Richard had been trying to explain about his AI system. About communication, about one intelligence, whether human or artificial, recognizing patterns, responding to them, creating something new through the interaction. But more than that, it was about connection, real connection. The kind that happens when two beings, two people, two ideas, two melodies meet and recognize each other and create something neither could have created alone. As Damon played, something remarkable began to happen in the room. Patricia Wu, Apex's financial analyst, found herself thinking about her mother. Her mother, who'd been diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's 3 years ago, who was slowly forgetting everything and everyone she'd ever known. Patricia spent her days analyzing risk and return, calculating the probability of success and failure. But she couldn't calculate how to get her mother back, couldn't quantify the grief of watching someone you love disappear in slow motion. The music that Damon was playing somehow captured that feeling. The searching quality of the melody, the way it kept reaching for something just out of grasp, the moments of clarity followed by moments of confusion. It was like listening to her mother's condition translated into sound. Patricia felt tears forming in her eyes and didn't try to stop them. Daniel Merchant, the healthcare technology specialist, was thinking about why he'd chosen this career path in the first place. 23 years ago, his son had been born with a congenital heart defect. The doctors had said he might not survive. But he did survive thanks to an innovative surgical technique that had been developed just months before. That experience had driven Daniel to fund healthcare innovations to find and support technologies that could give other families the same chance his family had been given. But somewhere along the way, he'd started thinking more about market opportunities than patient outcomes, more about return on investment than lives saved. The work had become abstract, theoretical, disconnected from the human reality it was supposed to serve. Damon's music reminded him of what he'd forgotten, reminded him that behind every data point was a person. Behind every percentage improvement in mortality rates was a family that got to keep their loved one. Behind every technological innovation was the possibility of a miracle. Thomas Brighton from Summit Peak Capital was thinking about his daughter. She was a music teacher, and he'd never really understood why she'd chosen that path. He'd wanted her to go into business, to follow in his footsteps, to build something significant. Teaching elementary school kids to play recorder seemed like such a waste of her potential. But listening to Damon play, Thomas suddenly understood something he'd never grasped before. Music wasn't just entertainment or decoration. It was a language that could communicate things that regular language couldn't touch. It was a way of making sense of the world, of processing emotion, of creating connection between people. His daughter wasn't wasting her potential. She was doing something essential. He made a mental note to call her after this meeting to tell her that he understood now, to apologize for all the times he'd suggested she should do something more practical with her life. Linda Okonkwo from Horizon Ventures was thinking about her grandmother in Lagos, about how her grandmother used to sing while cooking old Yoruba songs that Linda didn't understand the words to, but felt the meaning of nonetheless. Her grandmother had been gone for 5 years now, and Linda realized she couldn't remember the melodies anymore. They'd faded from her memory like dreams fade in the morning light. But Damon's playing evoked them somehow. Not the specific songs, but the feeling of them. The sense of being connected to something larger than yourself. The understanding that music and food and family were all part of the same thing, all different expressions of love and care and cultural continuity. Linda closed her eyes and let herself remember. Richard was watching his investors being transformed by Damon's music, and he was beginning to understand something profound about what he'd been trying to build with TechVantage. He'd conceived of his AI platform as a technical solution to a technical problem. Healthcare data was complex and overwhelming, so they'd built a system that could process it more efficiently than humans. Pattern recognition, predictive analytics, machine learning, all very sophisticated, all very impressive. But that's not really what healthcare was about, was it? Healthcare was about people, about moments of vulnerability and fear and hope, about patients who were terrified and families who were desperate and clinicians who were trying their best in impossible circumstances, about the human experience of illness and healing and mortality. Technology could support that human experience, could enhance it, could make it safer and more effective. But technology couldn't replace the fundamental truth that healthcare was at its core an act of human connection. That's what Damon's music was demonstrating. Not that technology was irrelevant, but that it was incomplete without the human element, without empathy and intuition and the kind of understanding that came not from algorithms, but from lived experience and genuine care. Richard looked at Damon, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for the first time. Not as the janitor who cleaned the floors, not as the background worker who was barely visible, but as a human being with depth and talent and a story that mattered. As someone who had something valuable to contribute, even if that contribution didn't fit neatly into the corporate hierarchy. How many other people had Richard overlooked? How many times had he walked past someone without seeing them, without recognizing their value, without understanding that everyone has depths that aren't immediately visible? The music continued to evolve. Damon's two hands were no longer having a simple conversation. They were creating something more complex. Multiple layers of melody and harmony, all weaving together, all supporting each other. It was like watching a community form in real time, different voices coming together to create something beautiful and coherent. Jessica, still standing in the doorway, was thinking about code, about elegant solutions and bugs that turned out to be features, and the way that sometimes the best programs emerged not from careful planning, but from improvisation and intuition. She'd always thought of programming as purely logical, purely rational. But watching Damon play, she realized that there was an art to it too, a creativity that couldn't be reduced to algorithms. Maybe that's what had been missing from her approach to fixing the network switch. She'd been thinking technically, running through troubleshooting protocols, following the logical steps. But maybe what she needed was to think more creatively, to improvise, to try something unconventional. The music Damon was playing somehow captured what Richard had been trying to explain about TechVantage's AI. The system didn't just process data mechanically. It learned. It adapted. It found connections that weren't programmed in advance. It was in its own way improvisational. And maybe that's what made it special. Not that it was perfectly logical and systematic, but that it had a kind of creative intelligence, an ability to recognize patterns that weren't obvious, to make leaps that weren't purely computational. Damon built the music toward a new level of intensity. The melodies became more urgent, more insistent. The harmonies grew richer, more complex. He was using every register of the piano now, from the deep bass notes that rumbled in your chest to the high treble notes that seemed to sparkle in the air. It was a sound that filled the entire room, that seemed to expand beyond the physical boundaries of the space. It was music that demanded attention, that insisted on being heard and felt and understood. And everyone in that room was listening. Not politely listening while thinking about other things, not waiting for it to be over so they could get back to business, but truly listening, giving the music their complete attention, letting it wash over them and transform them. This was what connection felt like, Damon thought. Real connection. The kind that transcended differences in background and status and profession. The kind that reminded you that underneath all the surface distinctions, people were people. We all felt joy and pain. We all hoped and feared. We all needed beauty and meaning and something larger than ourselves. Music created that connection, had always created it throughout human history. From the first drum circles around ancient fires, to the great symphonies of Mozart and Beethoven, to the jazz clubs of New Orleans, to this conference room in a San Francisco high-rise. Music reminded us that we belonged to each other. Damon's playing reached its emotional peak. His fingers flew across the keys, creating cascades of notes that tumbled and soared and resolved in unexpected ways. It was virtuosic, playing the kind that came from decades of practice and deep musical understanding. But it wasn't showy for the sake of being showy. Every note served the larger purpose. Every flourish meant something. And then, just when it seemed like the music might spiral off into chaos, Damon brought it back. He returned to the simple question he'd posed at the beginning of this final movement. The melodic line clear and searching, asking its question one more time. But this time the answer was different. This time the answer was certain, confident, complete. Damon had found what he'd been searching for. Not just in this improvisation, but in the 8 years since Angela's death. He'd found a way back to himself, a way back to the music, a way to honor the past while moving forward into the future. His hands prepared for the final section of the performance, the conclusion, the resolution, the moment that would bring everything together. Damon took a breath. And then he poured everything he had into the final crescendo. It started quietly, deceptively so. A simple chord progression, almost hymn-like in its purity. The kind of music his grandmother might have played in church all those years ago. But there was power contained in that simplicity, like a river gathering force before a waterfall. The progression repeated, and with each repetition, Damon added more. A bass line that anchored the harmony, a counter-melody that wove between the chords, rhythmic variations that created momentum. The music began to build. In the room, people leaned forward unconsciously, pulled by the gathering energy of the performance. They could feel it coming, the climax that Damon had been building toward for nearly 20 minutes. The moment when everything would come together. Damon thought about all the threads he'd woven throughout this improvisation. The blues elements from his New Orleans roots, the classical harmonies he'd studied formally, the jazz improvisation that had been his language for decades, the pain of loss and the hope of healing, the past and the present and the possibility of a future. All of it needed to come together now. All of it needed to find resolution. His hands moved faster, covering more of the keyboard. The left hand created a driving rhythm, insistent and powerful. The right hand soared above it, the melody reaching higher and higher, stretching toward something just beyond reach. The music grew louder, more intense. Damon was playing with complete commitment, now holding nothing back. Every ounce of technique he'd developed over 42 years of playing. Every emotion he'd suppressed over 8 years of silence. Every hope he had for what came next. All of it flowing through his fingers, through the piano, into the air. Patricia Wu was openly crying now, no longer trying to hide it. The music had broken through all her professional defenses, all her careful emotional control. She was thinking about her mother, yes, but also about herself. About how she'd become so focused on analysis and metrics that she'd forgotten how to feel. About how numbers couldn't capture everything that mattered. Daniel Merchant had his hand over his heart, feeling it beat in rhythm with Damon's left hand. He was remembering his son's surgery, the hours of waiting, the moment when the doctor had come out and said those 3 perfect words. He's going to be okay. He was remembering why any of this mattered, why he'd devoted his career to healthcare technology, why the work was worth doing even when it was hard. Thomas Brighton was thinking about his daughter again, but also about himself. About all the things he'd dismissed as impractical or frivolous because they didn't have clear financial value. About how maybe the most important things in life were precisely those things that couldn't be quantified or measured. About how he'd spent so much time building wealth that he'd forgotten to build meaning. Linda Okonkwo was transported back to Lagos, to her grandmother's kitchen, to the feeling of being young and loved and part of something larger than herself. She was understanding maybe for the first time why she'd felt so disconnected since moving to America. Not because America was bad, but because she'd left behind the parts of herself that couldn't be expressed in English or captured on a resume. The parts that needed music and food and family and cultural continuity to feel whole. Victoria Ashford was having the most surprising reaction of all. In her 3 decades in venture capital, she'd prided herself on her objectivity, her ability to evaluate opportunities without emotional interference, her discipline in following proven investment frameworks and ignoring gut feelings. But sitting here listening to Damon play, she realized that her best investments hadn't come from frameworks. They'd come from moments exactly like this. Moments when something unexpected happened that revealed a deeper truth. Moments when she saw beyond the surface presentation to the real value underneath. She was thinking about Richard and his team. About the fact that they'd handled this technological disaster not by panicking or making excuses, but by being open to an unconventional solution. About the fact that their janitor felt comfortable and empowered to step up in a crisis. About what that said about the culture they'd built. She was thinking about the AI platform itself, about how Richard's presentation had tried to explain it technically, but Damon's performance had demonstrated it emotionally. The system was about pattern recognition and intervention and healing, and Damon had shown them what that actually meant. What it felt like, why it mattered. The music continued to build. Damon was playing at the absolute limit of his ability now, his fingers moving so fast they were almost a blur. Complex chords in the left hand, rapid runs in the right hand, the two coming together in moments of perfect synchronization before separating again to continue their individual paths. It was exhausting. Physically, mentally, emotionally exhausting. Damon could feel the strain in his hands, in his arms, in his back. He hadn't played this intensely in 8 years, and his body was reminding him of that fact. But he couldn't stop now. Not when he was this close to the resolution. Not when he could feel the ending approaching, could sense the shape of it, could almost hear what was coming next. He thought about Angela one more time. About the promise he'd made at her funeral, but never kept. The promise to keep living, to keep creating, to honor her memory by continuing to make the world more beautiful. He'd broken that promise by going silent, by becoming invisible, by pretending that the music didn't matter. But he was keeping it now. Right now. In this moment. This performance was for her. This music was his way of saying, I'm sorry I stopped playing. I'm sorry I gave up. But I'm back now. I'm here. And I'm going to keep playing until I can't anymore. The music reached its absolute peak. Every note, every chord, every rhythmic element converging into a single moment of perfect intensity. Damon's whole body was involved now, not just his fingers, but his arms and shoulders and torso, all of him channeling the music into the piano. And then, at the very height of that intensity, Damon made a choice. He didn't resolve it in the expected way, didn't land on the predictable final chord. Instead, he let the music transform. Let it shift from major to minor. Let it become something more complex, more ambiguous, more true to the messiness of real life. Because that was the truth, wasn't it? Life didn't resolve neatly. Pain didn't disappear just because you wanted it to. Loss remained loss even as you learned to live with it. But that didn't mean there was no hope, no beauty, no possibility of healing. Damon's final chord was complex. It contained both joy and sorrow, both resolution and tension, both the question and the answer. It was the musical equivalent of saying, this is life. This is what it means to be human. And it's hard, but it's also beautiful. And it's worth it. He let that chord ring out, filling the room with its rich complexity. Let it sustain as long as the piano would allow the sound gradually fading, but never quite disappearing. And when it finally fell below the threshold of hearing, Damon didn't add anything else, didn't try to have the last word. Just let the silence return. Let the room absorb what had just happened. Let everyone process the journey they'd just been taken on. His hands remained on the keys for a moment longer, and then slowly he lifted them away. It was done. 23 minutes of continuous improvisation. 23 minutes of pouring his entire self into the music. 23 minutes of finding his way back to who he'd been and who he might become. Damon sat perfectly still, his breath coming in ragged gasps, sweat on his forehead, tears still wet on his cheeks. The room was completely silent. And then someone stood up. It was Victoria Ashford. She rose from her chair slowly, her eyes still fixed on Damon. And then deliberately, she began to clap. The sound of her applause echoed in the silent room. Slow at first, measured. Each clap distinct and intentional. And then Daniel Merchant stood up. Then Patricia Wu. Then Thomas Brighton and Linda Okonkwo. Then all the other investors, one by one, rising from their chairs, joining the applause. Richard was clapping too. His earlier devastation transformed into something else entirely. Awe, gratitude, a recognition that something extraordinary had just happened. Jessica stood in the doorway, tears streaming down her face, applauding this man she'd passed in the hallways for years, without really seeing. The applause grew louder, faster. It transformed from polite acknowledgement into genuine enthusiasm, the kind of response you give when you've witnessed something that moved you, changed you, made you see the world differently. It became a standing ovation, All 23 investors on their feet, applauding a janitor who'd just played the piano for 23 minutes in the middle of a failed business presentation. Damon remained seated at the piano, overwhelmed. He'd performed countless times in his life, in clubs and concerts and private events, but he'd never experienced a reaction quite like this. Not just appreciation for his technical skill, but recognition of something deeper. Understanding. Connection. He tried to stand, but his legs were shaking. The physical and emotional exhaustion of the performance had caught up with him. He gripped the edge of the piano bench, steadying himself. Richard crossed the room quickly and offered his hand. Damon took it, and Richard helped him to his feet. And then, before Damon could say anything, Richard pulled him into an embrace. "Thank you," Richard said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you. You just saved more than a deal. You reminded us why we're doing this, all of this." Damon didn't know what to say. Didn't know how to respond to this sudden visibility, this unexpected recognition. For 8 years, he'd been invisible, and now suddenly everyone was seeing him. Victoria Ashford approached them, still applauding. When she reached Damon, she stopped clapping and extended her hand. "I don't know who you are," she said, "but that was one of the most remarkable things I've ever witnessed in a business setting. Hell, one of the most remarkable things I've ever witnessed, period." Damon shook her hand, still unable to find words. His throat was tight with emotion. "Where did you learn to play like that?" she asked. "New Orleans," Damon managed to say. "A long time ago." "Well," Victoria said, turning to Richard, "I think we need to revisit our assessment of this presentation. Don't you?" Richard looked confused. "But the technology, the demo, it still failed. Everything I was trying to show you. You showed us something more important than a tech demo," Victoria interrupted. "You showed us the culture of your company, the kind of people you have here, the openness to unconventional solutions, the values that run deeper than the technology." She gestured to Damon. "This man works for you." He felt comfortable enough to step up when things went wrong. He offered a solution that had nothing to do with his job description. And you were secure enough as a leader to let him try it. That tells me more about TechVantage than any demo could have. Daniel Merchant had joined them now. "She's right, Richard. What we just witnessed, this wasn't a distraction from your pitch. It was the pitch. You've been trying to tell us that your AI can see patterns and make connections that humans miss. And we just watched a human being do exactly that with music. He demonstrated the principle better than any algorithm could have." Patricia Wu was wiping her eyes, not bothering to hide the fact that she'd been crying. "That music, it made me feel something I haven't let myself feel in years. It reminded me why I got into healthcare investing in the first place, to help people, to make lives better, not just to generate returns." Other investors were gathering around now, all of them wanting to meet Damon, to shake his hand, to tell him how his performance had affected them. Thomas Brighton said, "I'm going to call my daughter as soon as I leave here. Tell her I finally understand what she's been trying to tell me about the importance of music." Linda Okonkwo said, "My grandmother would have loved what you just played. She always said music was how we stay connected to our ancestors." Cameron Foster, the technical expert from Apex, was perhaps the most surprising. "I spend my days evaluating code and algorithms," he said to Damon. "And what you just did was more elegant, more sophisticated, more genuinely intelligent than most of the AI systems I analyze. You were processing thousands of variables in real time, making creative decisions, adapting to the moment. That's the kind of intelligence we should be trying to build into our systems." Damon listened to all of this, still struggling to process what was happening. 20 minutes ago, he'd been invisible. Just the janitor. Just the guy who cleaned the floors. And now he was at the center of attention, being celebrated by some of the most powerful people in Silicon Valley. It felt surreal, overwhelming. But also in a way he couldn't quite articulate, it felt right. Like he was finally being seen. Finally being recognized for who he really was, not just what his job title said he was. Richard was looking at him with an expression Damon had never seen directed at him before. Respect. Genuine respect. Damon, Richard said, "I owe you an apology. You've been working here for 8 years, and I never really saw you. Never asked you about yourself. Never acknowledged that you might have depths and talents and a story that mattered." "It's okay," Damon said quietly. "That's kind of the point of being a janitor. You're not supposed to be seen." "No," Richard said firmly. "That's not okay, and that's going to change. Starting right now." Victoria cleared her throat, bringing everyone's attention back to her. "Richard, we came here today to evaluate a $60 million investment. And what we've discovered is that TechVantage is worth investing in, not because of the technology, though I'm sure that's impressive too, but because of what this company represents. Innovation. Humanity. The recognition that the best solutions often come from unexpected places." She paused, looking around at her fellow investors. "I'm prepared to recommend to my partners that we move forward with the investment. Daniel, Patricia, Cameron. What do you think?" One by one, they nodded their agreement. Thomas Brighton and Linda Okonkwo, representing the other firms, indicated their interest in co-investing as well. Victoria turned back to Richard. "You'll still need to send us the recorded demo once you get your systems working. We'll still need to do our technical due diligence, but I think it's fair to say that what happened here today has fundamentally changed our assessment of this opportunity." Richard looked like he might cry. "Thank you. Thank you so much. And Damon." He turned to face him fully. "Thank you. I don't know how to thank you enough." Damon smiled a real smile, the first genuine smile in 8 years. "You don't need to thank me. I just played the piano. That's all." That's all. Jessica had joined the group now. "Damon, you just saved this company. You just made it possible for us to continue our work to save lives to make a difference. That's not nothing." "I know," Damon said, "but I wasn't doing it for that. I was doing it because it was time. Time to stop hiding. Time to remember who I used to be. Time to play again." He looked around at all these faces, all these people who were suddenly seeing him, really seeing him. And maybe he added quietly, time to start believing that even invisible people can make a difference. The energy in the room had completely transformed. What had been a formal high-stakes business presentation had become something more intimate, more human. The investors were no longer just evaluating an opportunity. They were participating in a story, a moment that none of them would forget. But there was still business to attend to. So Victoria said, returning to her seat, "I think we still need to hear the rest of your presentation, Richard. You were in the middle of showing us your platform interface when the technology failed. And while what Damon did was extraordinary, we do still need to understand the actual product." Of course, Richard said, his mind racing to figure out how to proceed without the demo system. The interface is designed to be intuitive for clinical staff. With Richard, Jessica interrupted from the doorway. She was holding her laptop, a slight smile on her face. "I think I can get us back online." Everyone turned to look at her. What Richard said. "You said the network switch was completely fried. You said it would take hours to replace." "It is," Jessica confirmed. "But while everyone was watching Damon play, I had an idea. What if I bypassed the main switch entirely? I've got our mobile hotspot in my office. If I set up a temporary network through that, we can run the demo from my laptop directly to the screens." Cameron Foster, the tech expert from Apex, nodded approvingly. "That's smart. Unconventional, but smart. That's exactly the kind of adaptive thinking that separates good engineers from great ones." Jessica blushed slightly at the compliment. "It won't be as smooth as the original setup. The bandwidth isn't as robust, but it should be enough to show you the interface and run through some basic demos." Do it, Richard said. Whatever you need. Jessica got to work, and within 5 minutes she'd managed to restore a connection. The screens flickered to life, showing the TechVantage logo once again. But something had changed, When Richard resumed his presentation, he approached it differently than he had before. He was less focused on the technical specifications, less concerned with impressing the investors with complexity. Instead, he talked about the impact, about the patients whose lives could be saved, about the clinicians who could do their jobs more effectively, about the human cost of the problems TechVantage was solving. He'd learned something from Damon's performance. That connection mattered more than complexity. That emotion was as important as logic. That the best way to communicate value wasn't through data and demos alone, but through making people feel why something mattered. The investors listened with renewed attention. They asked thoughtful questions, not trying to poke holes in the presentation, but genuinely trying to understand the vision and the potential. Patricia Wu asked about the hospitals currently using the system. Can you share any specific cases where your AI made a difference? Richard nodded. Last month at St. Mary's Hospital in Oakland, our system flagged a patient who was showing early signs of a stroke. The symptoms were so subtle that the nursing staff hadn't noticed them yet. But our AI picked up on minute changes in the patient's speech patterns during routine checks combined with slight variations in vital signs. Because of that early alert, the patient received treatment within the critical window. The doctors said that without that early intervention, the patient would have suffered permanent brain damage. He paused, letting that sink in. That's just one case. We have hundreds of examples like that. Hundreds of patients who got better outcomes because our system saw something that human observation alone would have missed. Daniel Merchant leaned forward. And the clinicians, how do they respond to the system? Is there resistance to having an AI second-guessing their decisions? That's a great question, Richard said. And yes, initially there was some resistance, but we designed the system to be a support tool, not a replacement. It makes suggestions, not demands. And over time, as the clinical staff have seen the results, they've become advocates. In our most recent satisfaction survey, 93% of nurses and doctors using the system said it made them better at their jobs. The presentation continued for another 15 minutes. Jessica ran through several demo scenarios showing how the interface worked, how alerts were prioritized, how the system learned from feedback. It wasn't as polished as the original plan, but it was effective. Maybe more effective actually because it felt more real, more honest. When Richard finished, Victoria stood up again. Thank you. That was exactly what we needed to see. The combination of what you showed us and what we experienced earlier, it paints a complete picture of what TechVantage is and what it can become. She looked at her fellow investors. I propose we schedule a follow-up meeting for next week to finalize the investment terms. Does everyone agree? There were nods all around. Excellent, Victoria said. She turned back to Richard. We'll have our attorneys send over a term sheet by Wednesday. Assuming the technical due diligence checks out, and I have no reason to believe it won't, I think we're looking at a deal. Richard felt like he could breathe fully for the first time in weeks. Thank you, all of you. This means everything to us, to the company, to the patients we'll be able to help. As the investors began gathering their things this time, with actual intention to proceed, not to escape, several of them made a point of stopping to speak with Damon again, to shake his hand one more time, to tell him how much his performance had meant to them. Damon accepted their gratitude with humility, and Grace, still somewhat overwhelmed by the attention, but handling it with dignity. Victoria was the last investor to leave. At the door, she turned back to Richard and Damon. What happened here today? This is what venture capital should be about. Not just evaluating business models and financial projections, but recognizing when something special is happening. when people and ideas come together in ways that create real value. She smiled. I've been doing this for 32 years, and I've never had a pitch meeting quite like this one. Thank you both for reminding me why I love this work. And then she was gone, leaving Richard, Jessica, and Damon alone in the conference room. The next 2 hours passed in a blur of activity. Jessica worked with the IT team to replace the failed network switch and restore full functionality to the building's systems. She also began preparing a comprehensive recorded demo to send to the investors, even though it seemed increasingly clear that they'd already made their decision. Richard spent the time on phone calls, with his board of directors sharing the news, with his attorney beginning to prepare for the due diligence process, with the leaders of the hospitals using TechVantage telling them that they'd secured the funding to expand the platform. Every conversation felt surreal. Every time he explained what had happened, how the technology had failed, how a janitor had played the piano, how the investors had decided to fund them anyway. It sounded implausible, like a story someone made up to illustrate a point about corporate culture or unconventional thinking. But it had happened. It was real. And in a few days, once the paperwork was signed, TechVantage would have $60 million to scale their platform to reach more hospitals to save more lives. Damon had returned to his regular duties. He'd retrieved his cleaning cart from the conference room and continued his rounds through the building, restocking bathrooms, emptying trash cans, wiping down surfaces, the same tasks he'd been doing for 8 years. But it felt different now. People nodded to him in the hallways, made eye contact, said hello. Word had spread quickly through the building about what had happened in the conference room, about Damon's performance, about how he'd saved the company. Some people stopped him to say thank you. Others asked him about his background, about New Orleans, about how he'd learned to play like that. A few asked if he gave lessons. Damon answered their questions politely, but didn't linger. He had work to do. And despite everything that had happened, he was still the janitor. That was still his job. Around 3 o'clock, Richard found him in the break room on the 37th floor refilling the coffee supplies. Damon, can we talk? In my office. Damon nodded and followed Richard to the executive suite on the 43rd floor. He'd cleaned this area countless times, but had never actually been invited into Richard's office for a conversation. The office was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling windows with a panoramic view of the city. Modern furniture that probably cost more than Damon made in a year. Awards and photographs on the walls documenting Richard's career. Please sit, Richard said, gesturing to one of the chairs facing his desk. Damon sat feeling uncomfortable in his janitor's uniform, in this space clearly designed for people wearing tailored suits. Richard sat across from him, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Finally, Richard said, I want to offer you a different role in the company. Damon had been expecting something like this, but hearing it said out loud still surprised him. I appreciate that, but I'm fine with my current position. Are you? Richard asked gently. Damon, you're clearly a talented musician. You have skills and abilities that go far beyond janitorial work. Don't you want to do something more with that? Damon considered the question carefully. I'm not sure what more would look like. I'm 55 years old. I haven't played professionally in 8 years. The world has moved on. And honestly, I'm not sure I want to go back to that life. What if you didn't have to go back? Richard said. What if you could do something new? Something that honored your musical talents but was also connected to what we're trying to accomplish here. Like what I don't know exactly, Richard admitted. But I know there's value in what you bring. Maybe you could work with our team on thinking about user experience, about how to make our interface more intuitive. Music is all about patterns and rhythm and flow, right? Those same principles apply to software design. Damon smiled. You're trying to fit me into your world. I appreciate that, But I think what happened today was powerful precisely because I'm not part of your world. Because I was the janitor who played the piano, not a consultant or a designer or someone with a fancy title. Richard leaned back in his chair, processing that. So you want to stay as janitor? I want to think about it, Damon said. What happened today was intense, emotional, overwhelming. I need some time to process what it means before I make any decisions about changing my life. Fair enough, Richard said. But I want you to know that the offer stands. Whatever you decide, you'll have a place here. And not just as janitor, though. If that's what you choose, that's fine too. But as someone valued. Someone who matters. Thank you, Damon said. That means a lot. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Damon said, Can I ask you something? Of course. Why did you let me do it? When I walked into that conference room and said I wanted to help you, had every reason to say no. It was a crazy idea. It didn't make sense. You were in the middle of the most important pitch of your career. But you let me try anyway. Why Richard thought about it? Honestly, I don't know. Desperation, maybe. Or maybe I just recognized something in your eyes. A certainty. A knowledge that you could help even if I didn't understand how. Sometimes you just have to trust people, especially when it doesn't make logical sense. Damon nodded. That's what improvisation is. Trusting yourself. Trusting that you'll find your way through it even when you don't know where you're going. Maybe that's what all of life is, Richard said. Improvisation. We pretend we have it all planned out, all figured out. But really, we're all just making it up as we go, hoping we'll land on the right notes. Some people are better at it than others, Damon said with a slight smile. Yeah, Richard agreed. But I think anyone can learn. If they're willing to take the risk. If they're willing to be vulnerable and uncertain and trust that something good might emerge. They talked for a while longer. About music and business and life. About Angela and Damon's past in New Orleans. About Richard's vision for TechVantage and what it could become. They talked like equals, like two human beings sharing a moment of genuine connection, all the usual hierarchies and roles temporarily set aside. Eventually, Damon stood up. I should get back to work. Still have the rest of the building to finish. Of course, Richard said. He stood and extended his hand. Thank you again, Damon. For everything. They shook hands. And as Damon turned to leave, Richard added, Think about what I said. About a different role. But even if you decide to stay where you are, I hope you'll keep playing. The world needs more beauty in it. And you create beauty. Damon paused at the door, his hand on the handle. I'll think about it, he said. About all of it. And then he was gone back to his cart, back to his duties, back to the familiar routine of his job. But everything felt different now, like he'd crossed some invisible threshold and couldn't go back to who he'd been before, even if he wanted to. 3 days later, on a quiet Thursday evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Damon found himself back at the piano in conference room 42. He'd been thinking about it constantly since the presentation. The feeling of playing again, the rush of emotion, the connection with the music that he'd thought was lost forever. It called to him, pulled at him, wouldn't let him rest. So he'd come back. After finishing his evening rounds, instead of going home, he'd returned to this room, to this piano, to the instrument that had woken him up after 8 years of sleepwalking through life. The building was quiet. Most everyone had left for the day. The usual hum of activity was replaced by the gentle silence of empty spaces. Just the occasional sound of the HVAC system, the distant elevator ding, the nighttime sounds of a building at rest. Damon sat at the piano and lifted the fallboard. The keys gleamed in the soft light from the city beyond the windows. He placed his hands on them, feeling their familiar shape and weight. And he began to play. Not for anyone else this time, just for himself, just because he needed to the way he used to need to in New Orleans, the way he'd denied himself for 8 years. He played a slow blues, something mournful and beautiful, something that acknowledged the pain while also transcending it. He didn't hear Richard enter the room, didn't know he was there until he finished the song and heard applause from behind him. Damon turned to see Richard standing near the door, his jacket off his tie loosened, looking exhausted but content. "Don't stop on my account," Richard said, moving farther into the room. I wanted to play again. Hope it's okay that I'm here after hours." "More than okay," Richard said. He pulled out one of the chairs and sat down, still maintaining a respectful distance from the piano. "I'm glad you came back to it." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Richard said, "I got the term sheet from Apex today. We're finalizing the deal next week. It's really happening. We're going to get the funding." "That's wonderful," Damon said sincerely. "You deserve it. The work you're doing, it matters." "It does," Richard agreed. "And it wouldn't be happening without you. The investors told me that what you did fundamentally changed their perception of the company, not just the immediate impact, but what it revealed about our culture and values." Damon shook his head. "I just played the piano. You're the one who built something worth investing in. I built the technology," Richard corrected. "But you showed them the soul, the humanity behind it, the reason why any of it matters." Another pause. Then Richard asked, "Have you thought about what we discussed? About taking on a different role?" "I have," Damon said. "A lot, actually, and I think I need to stay where I am. At least for now." Richard looked disappointed but tried to hide it. Can I ask why Damon turned back to the piano, his fingers resting on the keys but not playing? "Because I'm not ready yet. What happened the other day, it was powerful, transformative, but it was also terrifying. For 8 years I've been invisible, safe, hidden away from everything that could hurt me, and in one moment I put myself out there again, made myself visible, vulnerable, connected." He played a few soft notes, and it was beautiful, but it was also overwhelming. "I need time to adjust, to figure out who I am now that I'm not running anymore, to understand what comes next." "I respect that," Richard said. "But I want you to know that whenever you're ready, the offer stands. Not just a job offer, but an invitation. To be part of what we're building here. To contribute in whatever way feels right to you." "Thank you," Damon said. He turned to face Richard fully. "Can I tell you something about why I did it? Why I walked into that conference room and offered to play?" "Please," my wife Damon began. "Angela. She died 8 years ago. Car accident. Drunk driver. One moment she was alive and we were planning our future together, and the next moment she was gone." Richard listened without interrupting, giving Damon space to tell his story. "After she died, I couldn't play anymore. Every time I sat at a piano, all I could feel was the absence, the silence where her presence used to be. So I stopped playing, stopped being a musician, stopped being myself in a lot of ways." Damon's voice was steady but full of emotion. "I came to San Francisco to disappear, to be nobody, to avoid feeling anything too deeply because feeling anything meant feeling the loss of her. And for 8 years, that's exactly what I did. I disappeared. I became invisible. I told myself I was fine, that this was enough. But it wasn't," Richard said quietly. "No," Damon agreed. "It wasn't. I was just existing, not living, just waiting for time to pass until I could join her." He played a few more notes, a melody that sounded like longing. "But then I saw you standing there in that conference room with everything falling apart. And I saw something in your face that I recognized. desperation, fear. The feeling of watching something important slip away and being powerless to stop it. And I realized Damon continued that I had the power to help. Maybe. Possibly. I didn't know if it would work, didn't know if playing the piano would change anything, but I knew that I could try, that I could offer something, that I could be useful. He looked at Richard directly, and in that moment I understood something I should have understood years ago. Angela wouldn't have wanted me to disappear. She would have wanted me to keep living, keep creating, keep helping people when I could. That's who she was, and that's who she loved me for being. So I played, Damon said. Not to save your company, though, I'm glad it helped. But to honor her, to finally keep the promise I made at her funeral. The promise to keep living, to keep making the world more beautiful, to keep being the person she believed I could be. Richard felt tears forming in his eyes. That's a beautiful reason, a beautiful story. Thank you for sharing it with me. You asked why I don't want to change my job, Damon said. And the answer is that I need to do this slowly. I spent 8 years building walls around myself. I can't tear them all down at once. But I can start. I can keep playing. I can let people see me. I can contribute in small ways while I figure out who I am now. The janitor who plays piano, Richard said with a slight smile. For now, Damon agreed. But maybe eventually something more. When I'm ready. They talked for another hour. About Angela and her love of music. About Richard's own marriage and his 2 children. About the challenges of balancing work and life and meaning. About the ways that people hide from pain and the courage it takes to be vulnerable again. Finally, Richard stood up to leave. I should get home. My wife will be wondering where I am. Give her a hug, Damon said. Tell her you love her. Don't wait. Don't assume there will be more time. I will. Richard promised. And Damon, keep playing. Not just for Angela, but for yourself. You deserve to have music in your life again. After Richard left, Damon sat at the piano for a while longer. He played a song he'd written for Angela years ago when they were first married. A song he hadn't thought about in nearly a decade. The melody came back to him easily, like it had been waiting all this time to be remembered. And as he played, Damon felt something shift inside him. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden healing of all his wounds, but a small opening. A crack in the armor. A possibility. Maybe he could do this. Maybe he could live again. Not the same life he had had before that was gone forever, but a new life. One that honored the past while moving forward into an uncertain future. One that included music, and beauty, and connection, and the possibility that even after terrible loss, there could still be meaning, still be purpose, still be reasons to keep going. Damon played until his fingers were tired, and then he carefully lowered the fallboard covering the keys once again. But not forever. Not hiding them away, just closing them until the next time. Because there would be a next time. He was sure of that now. 3 months after the presentation that changed everything, TechVantage was thriving. The deal with Apex Venture Partners and their co-investors had closed. $60 million in new funding had allowed them to expand their team, enhance their technology, and begin rolling out their platform to 20 additional hospitals across the country. Early results were even better than projected. Patient outcomes were improving. Healthcare costs were decreasing. Clinicians were embracing the system. Every metric that mattered was trending in the right direction. Richard Bennett was being profiled in tech publications. TechVantage was being cited as a case study in successful healthcare innovation. The company that had almost died in that conference room was now being held up as an example of how to do things right. But for Richard, The most important change wasn't the funding or the press or the metrics. It was the culture shift that had happened after Damon's performance. People were more visible to each other now. Not just the executives and engineers, but everyone. The support staff, the administrative workers, the maintenance crews. Everyone had a name. Everyone had a story. Everyone mattered. Richard had implemented regular listening sessions where employees from all levels of the organization could share ideas, concerns, and perspectives. The best innovation in the last quarter had come from a suggestion by someone in the mailroom. The most effective process improvement had been proposed by a member of the cleaning crew. It turned out that the people who were often invisible had insights and ideas that were incredibly valuable. You just had to actually see them, actually listen to them. Damon was still the janitor. He'd turned down multiple offers for different roles, still not ready to make that change. But he'd made one significant adjustment to his routine. Every Thursday evening, after most of the staff had gone home, Damon played the piano in conference room 42. It had started as a private thing just for himself, but word spread, and gradually people started staying late on Thursdays to listen. It wasn't a performance exactly. There was no stage, no spotlight, no formal structure. Just Damon sitting at the piano playing whatever he felt like playing while people who wanted to listen sat quietly in the room or stood in the hallway. Sometimes he played jazz standards, sometimes classical pieces, sometimes he improvised. Sometimes he played songs from his New Orleans days, and sometimes when he was feeling brave, he played the songs he'd written for Angela. The Thursday evening sessions became a beloved ritual at TechVantage, a moment of beauty and reflection in the middle of a hectic work environment. A reminder that there was more to life than productivity and deadlines and quarterly targets. But Damon was doing something else with his music too, something he'd started 6 weeks after the famous presentation. He'd begun volunteering at a community center in the Tenderloin teaching piano to kids who couldn't afford private lessons. At first, it was just 1 hour a week, but it had expanded to 3 hours. And Damon was thinking about expanding it further. The kids loved him, not just because he was patient and encouraging, but because he understood what it meant to lose something precious and find it again. He taught them more than just notes and scales and technique. He taught them that music could be a lifeline, a way to express things that had no words, a path back to yourself when you got lost. One of his students was a 12-year-old girl named Maya, whose mother had died the previous year. She reminded Damon of himself at that age, raw talent mixed with deep pain, looking for a way to make sense of a world that didn't make sense. He'd given her the same lesson his grandmother had given him all those years ago. Music is prayer made audible. And when you don't know how to pray with words, you can pray with melody and rhythm and harmony. Maya was flourishing under his guidance. And teaching her teaching all of them was helping Damon heal in ways he hadn't expected. It turned out that sharing his gift, passing it on to the next generation, was as therapeutic as playing for himself. On this particular Thursday evening, 3 months after everything changed, Damon sat at the piano in conference room 42 with an unusually large audience. Word had gotten out that today was special, that Damon was going to play something he'd never played publicly before. Richard was there, of course, and Jessica, and most of the executive team, but also people from every department, engineers and analysts and support staff and security guards, people who'd worked alongside Damon for years without really knowing him. People who now understood that the quiet janitor was so much more than his job title suggested. Victoria Ashford was there too, visiting TechVantage for a board meeting. She'd made a point of scheduling the meeting on a Thursday so she could experience one of Damon's sessions. She'd heard stories from her colleagues who'd attended previous performances, and she wanted to witness it for herself. Damon sat at the piano, feeling the weight of all those eyes on him. But it was a different kind of weight than before. Not pressure or judgment, just attention. Presence. People who genuinely wanted to hear what he had to say through music. He took a breath and began to play. The piece he'd chosen was one he'd written in New Orleans years before Angela's death. It was called Morning Light because he'd written it one Sunday morning while watching the sun rise over the Mississippi, feeling grateful for his life and his love and his music. He'd never played it after Angela died, couldn't bear to touch something so deeply connected to their happiness together. But he was ready now. Ready to honor those memories without being destroyed by them. Ready to celebrate what they'd had instead of only mourning what he'd lost. The melody was gentle but complex. Not sad exactly, but touched with the awareness that beautiful things are temporary. That light always gives way to darkness and then returns again. That loss and joy are intertwined in ways we can't fully untangle. As Damon played, he thought about Angela, about how she'd loved this song, about how she'd asked him to play it on their wedding day and again on their 10th anniversary and countless times in between. But he also thought about the future, about Maya and his other students, about the Thursday evening sessions that had become so meaningful to so many people, about the possibility of doing more with his music when he was ready, about the life that was still ahead of him, uncertain but full of potential. The piece built to a gentle climax, a moment of pure, uncomplicated joy. And then it resolved landing on a final chord that contained both closure and openness, an ending that was also a beginning. When the last note faded, there was silence, and then applause, warm and genuine and full of appreciation, not just for the performance, but for the journey they'd all witnessed Damon take over the past 3 months. Victoria Ashford approached him after everyone else had left. "That was beautiful," she said. "I can see why these sessions have become so important to people here." "Thank you," Damon said. "It means a lot to me. More than I can really express. I wanted to tell you something." Victoria continued. "You probably don't remember, but at the original presentation I said that TechVantage was worth investing in because of what your presence revealed about the company's culture." "I remember," Damon said. "Well, I was right," Victoria said. "But I was also incomplete. Because it's not just about what your presence revealed, it's about what you've helped create. These sessions, the way people interact differently now, the openness to unconventional ideas. You've been a catalyst for real cultural change." She smiled. "That makes you more than a janitor who plays piano. It makes you a leader, whether you have a formal title or not." Damon considered that. "I think leadership can look a lot of different ways. It doesn't always have to be about hierarchy or authority. Sometimes it's just about showing up authentically, being willing to be vulnerable, creating spaces where others can do the same." "Exactly," Victoria said. "And that's the kind of leadership that often matters most." After Victoria left, Richard approached. He'd heard the conversation and wanted to add something. "She's right, you know," Richard said. "You've changed this company, changed me, if I'm being honest. You've reminded us all that people are more than their job descriptions, that value comes from unexpected places, that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be fully yourself." Damon smiled. "I'm still figuring out who that is, but I'm getting there." "We all are," Richard said. "I think that's the point. We're all works in progress, all trying to figure out how to be more than we were yesterday." They stood together in comfortable silence, looking out at the city lights beyond the windows. Finally, Damon said, "I've been thinking about your offer. about taking on a different role. Richard's attention sharpened. "Yeah, not yet," Damon said. "But maybe soon. I'm not quite ready. But I'm getting closer. And when I am ready, I'd like to talk about what that might look like." "Whenever you're ready," Richard said. "The door is open." Damon packed up his things and prepared to leave for the night. As he pushed his cleaning cart toward the elevator, he passed his reflection in the polished glass of the lobby. For 8 years, he'd avoided looking at himself, avoided acknowledging who he was or who he'd been or who he might become. But tonight, he paused, looked at his reflection, really looked. He saw a 55-year-old man in a janitor's uniform, but he also saw someone who'd survived terrible loss and was learning to live again. Someone who'd found the courage to be vulnerable. Someone who created beauty and meaning through music. Someone who mattered. Damon Cole, janitor, musician, teacher, survivor, human being, still figuring things out, still healing, still discovering who he was becoming. But no longer invisible, no longer hiding, no longer just waiting for life to be over. Living again. Finally, truly living again. Sometimes the heroes we need aren't the ones in the spotlight. They're not the CEOs with corner offices, or the investors with billions of dollars, or the engineers with advanced degrees. Sometimes the heroes are the people we walk past every day without seeing. The people whose names we don't know. The people we've labeled with job titles and forgotten to recognize as fully human. Sometimes heroism looks like a janitor sitting at a piano sharing a gift he'd buried for 8 years. Sometimes it looks like a CEO humble enough to let an unconventional solution unfold. Sometimes it looks like investors wise enough to recognize that the best returns come from human connection, not just technological innovation. The story of Damon Cole and TechVantage isn't really about a failed presentation or a successful deal, or even about music as beautiful as music is. It's about visibility, about seeing and being seen, about recognizing that everyone around us contains depths we know nothing about, that the person mopping the floor might be a brilliant musician, that the quiet colleague in the corner might be fighting battles we can't imagine, that we're all so much more than the roles we play or the labels we wear. It's about second chances, about the fact that it's never too late to return to yourself, to reclaim what you've lost, to honor the past while building a future, to let yourself be vulnerable and visible and fully alive even after you've been hiding for years. It's about the unexpected places that healing comes from. Sometimes it's not therapy or time or distance that helps us move forward. Sometimes it's a moment of crisis that demands we show up as our whole selves. Sometimes it's the courage to offer what we have even when we're not sure it will be enough. And it's about the power of beauty in a world that often feels cold and mechanistic. In a world of algorithms and efficiency and productivity metrics, we need reminders that we're human, that we feel, that we connect, that we create and appreciate beauty, not because it's useful, but because it's essential. Damon's piano performance that day didn't solve any technical problems. It didn't fix the broken network switch or make the demo magically work. But it did something more important. It reminded everyone in that room why they were doing what they were doing. It reconnected them to their humanity. It showed them that the best technologies aren't the ones that replace human judgment and intuition, but the ones that enhance it, support it, make space for it to flourish. And maybe that's the lesson we all need to hear. In our work and our lives and our relationships with the people around us, maybe we need to remember that efficiency and productivity and success, as important as they are, aren't the ultimate goals. The ultimate goal is connection, meaning, beauty, the creation of value that goes beyond what can be quantified on a spreadsheet or measured in quarterly returns. The ultimate goal is becoming more fully human, more fully ourselves, more fully awake to the preciousness of this moment and this life and the people we share it with. Damon Cole understood that. Richard Bennett learned it. The investors in that conference room experienced it, and maybe if we're paying attention, we can learn it too. So look around you today. Really look. See the people you usually walk past without noticing. Wonder about their stories. Recognize their humanity. Offer them the dignity of your attention. And if you've been hiding parts of yourself, if you've buried gifts or talents or dreams, because the pain of loss or failure felt too great, consider whether it might be time to try again. To be vulnerable again. To let yourself be seen again. Because the world needs what you have to offer. Your particular gifts, your unique perspective, your story that only you can tell. Maybe you're not a pianist like Damon. Maybe your gift is writing or teaching or building or healing or simply being present with others in their pain. Whatever it is, it matters. You matter. And sometimes all it takes is the courage to try one more time. To sit down at the metaphorical piano, place your hands on the keys, and see what music emerges. The world is waiting to hear it. Thank you for listening to this story. If you found meaning in it, I hope you'll share it with others who might need to hear it too. And I hope you'll remember every person you meet is carrying a story. Every person has depths you can't see. Every person deserves to be recognized as fully human, fully valuable, fully worthy of respect and care. Sometimes the people who save us are the ones we never expected. Sometimes the solutions come from the last places we'd think to look. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply see each other, truly see each other, and acknowledge the shared humanity that connects us all. Be well, be kind to others, and be brave enough to show the world who you really are.